Hi, everybody. So great to see everyone joining and coming in. Thank you for joining us here today for creating data interoperability, making data magic through interoperability and integration. We're going to get started in a couple minutes, but as you're coming in, please introduce yourself in the chat. And it'd be great if you could tell us your name, what you do, and where you are located. And then we'd also love to hear what you're hoping to get out of this brainwave. And we will get started in just a minute. Hi, everybody. And just as a couple more people are joining, welcome to Making Data Magic through Interoperability and Integration. While you're coming in, please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to hear your name, what you do, and where you are right now. And we'd also love to hear what you're hoping to collaborate on during the brainwave. And of course, if you are comfortable doing so, we'd love to invite you to come off camera to kind of increase the collaborative nature of today's session as well. And the format for today, we're going to be basically doing some short presentation sections followed by questions. So you're also welcome to just come off camera when you ask your question, or you can type questions in the Q&A section. But we'll go ahead and get started. We're thrilled to be here today and to meet you all, and we have a great group here today to speak with you. We are representing Project Unicorn, Lead Public Schools, and Voices College Bound Language Academies. My name is Elise Hawthorne, and I'm Technical Support and Implementation Lead with Project Unicorn, which is an initiative of Innovate EDU. And I also formerly worked in data and operations with the KIP NYC network. And I'll hand it over to Azaria and Haley to introduce themselves as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Azaria Bridgewater. I work with Lead Public Schools in Nashville, Tennessee as the Director of Data.
And I'm Haley Coughlin. I work with Voices College Bound Language Academies as the Data and Assessment Specialist, and we're located in the Bay Area in California.
So for today's session, again, please feel free to ask questions in the chat, get involved and start conversations. We're going to have a few different Q&A sections, so we'll be able to answer questions then, and we really want to have a collaborative and open dialogue. So I wanted to start off by sharing a little bit more information about Project Unicorn. So Project Unicorn is dedicated to promoting and implementing data interoperability in the K-12 space by providing support and resources for school systems and ed tech vendors. And with the shift to remote education in the pandemic, we've really seen more and more school systems realizing the importance of data interoperability. And interoperability is the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. So with school systems using more tech tools than ever, this could mean anything from teachers not having to enter the same scores into a bunch of different apps, to being able to create dashboards that can pull important insights from multiple systems and tools and help make better informed decisions. And Azaria and Haley are going to be showing some great examples today of how they have been able to implement data interoperability for their school systems. One really crucial application of interoperability that over this past year has been attendance. And they've both done amazing work with interoperability and attendance data. and they'll be sharing some of what they've done with the group, as well as opening up a discussion about attendance practices. So again, for the format of the brainwave, Azaria and Haley will each be sharing a bit about some topics, and after each topic, we'll open it up for a wider group conversation. So you can either use the Q&A portion of the window on the right side of the screen, or you can, there'll be an opportunity to just come off camera and ask a question if you'd like to do it that way as well. So the 3 topics that we're going to be covering are data hubs, asynchronous attendance, and chronic absenteeism. And I am going to turn it over to Azaria and Haley to talk about the first topic on the agenda, which is setting up data hubs.
Perfect. So for Lead Public Schools, we use Google Sites as our data hub. And on our Google site, we have the ability to control who has access to it. And so it's very easy to make sure that it stays within our network of schools. And so it was just a really good resource for us to use to put everything in one place and make sure that our data was secure and available for everyone to use. And so some of the pieces that we put on our data website are different reports, whether those be academic reports, enrollment reports, attrition reports, etc., or they could be data requests or professional development related to different systems, our staff directory. So we kind of use it as just one-stop shop for all of your data needs or data related needs.
And similarly at Voices, we also use Google Sites for our data hub. Our primary use for the hub was to have a place for school and network leaders, as well as teachers come to access academic data, but we've also been expanding it to include other things such as attendance, student rosters, and many other types of reports. To make sure that it's easy to access, we have the link to our hub on our internal intranet, which is everyone's homepage, so it's easy to find. And anytime we have a report that's made for a general or larger audience, we make sure we add it to the hub so that everyone can access everything whenever they need it. However, if there's reports for individuals or small groups of people, we tend not to share that in the hub just because we want to make sure it doesn't get cluttered.
So when we at Lead Public Schools were building out the hub, one of the things that we had to think through was how are we going to instruct our teachers and our staff on how to use the reports? And so for us, that meant that whenever there's a section of our data hub, such as enrollment data reports or attendance data reports that you see in the screenshot to the left, we wanted to make sure that there were no drop-down menus so that teachers would have to intentionally go to the attendance homepage to look at all of the different attendance reports that are there. We just wanted to make sure that they were consciously seeing what's available to them and consciously picking which report is most appropriate for the need that they have. And then in addition to that, we put our instructions for how to use the report in a video format, as well as a description right next to it, to make sure that if I'm not available to explain something, they can have it at their fingertips and they don't have to wait for me to explain what's available to them. And so we just wanted to be very conscious about giving teachers and staff the access that they need to use the reports without having to rely on someone else if they're not available to support them.
And at Voices, we had a different approach, but similar idea is that for each of our reports, it starts with a how to use this report page. So anytime anyone accesses the report, they have to click through this instruction page to actually get to the data. So on this page, we have 2 things. We have the table of contents, which shows what information can be found on each page of the report. And then we also have a little box called Things to Know. And this includes things like how the report can be read. It may give insight into what data is included, such as is it current year data, historical data. And if there's anything that I think might be misinterpreted about the report, I make sure to explicitly say that on the front page, so just to avoid any confusion and make sure there isn't any misinterpretation of the data. And sometimes I'll add in specific use cases if I think it's unclear how the report can be used.
So one of the other things that we had to be aware of when building reports is that not all the data is supposed to be viewed by everyone's eyes. So we needed to make sure that teachers were not necessarily looking at each other's data, or people from one school aren't able to look at data from another school. And so at Lead Public Schools, the way that we navigate that is by adding a visibility filter in our queries. The queries are then used to build the reports. So we embed it into our underlying data structure to make sure that when a teacher is going to a report, they're only able to see teacher level approved data, or if they're not allowed to or permitted to see the data at all, then it won't show up for them at all. And so that's how we kind of manage like network level viewers, teacher level viewers, school admin level viewers, etc.
Mm-hmm. And as Azaria said, we know like data security is super important. So the way that we handle it, we have two different levels of security. One is just the report itself. We only share the report with the groups of people that will need access to it, as well as our data hub in general. And as you can see on the left side, that it says under each report name, the audience is listed. So if ever anyone's ever like, oh, it's saying I can't access the report, we'll just check the audience and see if that report is intended for you. It also just clarifies which reports are meant for which groups of people. And then the second thing we do is within the report, restrict access. So for example, a teacher can only view their own the data for their own specific students.
Great. Thank you both so much for sharing about this. And yeah, I think these are both just such cool examples of everything you can do with a data hub. We'd love to hear from the group if anyone has any questions about what Azaria and Haley just shared, anything about implementing something like this, or kind of the decisions that went in to setting this up. So if you have any questions, feel free to either just jump on video or on audio, and you can just ask your question, or you can type it into the chat if you'd prefer. Check the Q&A. Okay. I know one question. Okay, so we have a question in the chat. Where do you have your documents?
Dora, can you clarify if these are documents about the reports or documents for like how we went about building the reports, or are they different kinds of documents in general?
Just in general, that both of our data hubs were stored on Google Sites.
Oh, okay. So where do the data reports come from? I believe Haley uses the same thing, but Lead Public Schools uses Google Data Reports or Data Studio. And so that's, we're connected to BigQuery. And when you saw the little query snippet in one of the slides, that fed into Data Studio.
Mm-hmm. We also use Google Data Studio. In the past, we have used Tableau, but Google Data Studio is free. So we did make the switch over to Google Data Studio for those reasons.
Yeah, and anyone out there who has ever used a BI tool, Data Studio, it does the same level of analysis and visualization for way less of a learning curve. There's like barely a learning curve at all.
And then I guess also kind of related to what skills are required with tools like Google Data Studio, Andrew asked if you employ coders, and if not, how do you source your code? Or if so, how do you source your code?
And I can speak for Voices. I'm the one that creates all of the reports, and the only coding that I know how to do is SQL, and I actually just learned it this year, so I have a very basic understanding of it, but that's been enough to get going and get reports created and all of that. And I think I took like a $10 course online somewhere to learn the basics. So I think some knowledge of SQL is needed, but I don't think you need to have like any great depth of knowledge on coding from my experience.
Yeah, I think it depends on like what all you're wanting to do. you can definitely use as much code as you'd like, whether that's just SQL or if that's employing Python to get your data into BigQuery or whatever. However you want to get your data into BigQuery, you can have fun with making it as simple or as complicated as you want to. But as far as building the reports in Data Studio goes, you could use SQL on the front end or on the back end. If you don't know SQL, you can just bring in the different data tables very easily, point click, and then merge the fields within Data Studio itself. So it's as simple as you want it to be or as complicated as you want it to be. And just anyone who's a little worried about using BigQuery or anything like that, you don't have to use BigQuery in order to use Data Studio. You can just link it to a spreadsheet or a CSV file that you upload. So it really is flexible depending on your skill set.
Mm-hmm. And I see Andrew added in that their challenge is connecting to primary sources through their APIs. So I don't have any knowledge in that background. We partner with Landing Zone through Innovate EDU, and they do all of that back-end stuff. And they give me the data in a nice format. I just have to take it and then put it into the report. So that's where we outsource the extra help needed through Landing Zone.
Yeah, so Landing Zone, we use them at Lead Public Schools to export some of our data from some of our sources. And then we also have some in-house methods of exporting data from other data sources. And so we tend to use Python for that. So.
Thank you both. And yeah, just to kind of add to that, yeah, I think that's another area where the data interoperability can really come in. And there are all different types of solutions you can use to achieve that goal. So Landing Zone, which Azaria and Haley both mentioned, is a good example of a data integrator that you could use to bring data together. We also, on our website, projectunicorn.org, which is linked in the description below, we have some other general information about data interoperability, and we have information on our website about using data standards and things like that, which can also be a step in journey towards interoperability. But yes, definitely to kind of plus one to that power of being able to bring different data sources together. And so for our next topic, we are going to discuss asynchronous attendance. And I will hand it back over to Azaria and Haley.
Yes.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry. So an obstacle that we had this year, as I'm sure many of you all also had, was just the way that the attendance policies changed and the way that we were tracking attendance. So for our state, students could be marked as present if they met any of certain criteria, including if they showed up to their remote Zoom class or if they completed asynchronous assignments. And so a challenge that our teachers had was that they had many different platforms that they had to check for the asynchronous work if their student didn't show up for their Zoom class. So that meant that teachers had to go through into each platform to see if a student was present or not, which, as you can imagine, takes a lot of time. So our solution was to build out a report that helped teachers find this information in one place, which I'll show you on the next slide.
Yes, and agreeing with Haley, we also had to go through a similar process of determining what does present mean during a virtual environment. And for us, the only platform that counted for present was if you log into your Zoom class. And so we had our teachers record that attendance in our behavior management platform. For us, that's Kickboard. And so teachers needed to mark every kid in their roster as either present or absent. And so part of the reason why we used our behavior management platform is because it was already rostered by class, by period. So it was easy for our teachers to spot, like, okay, this is the class. It has all of the students that I have. So now I can just have my Zoom screen side by side with my Kickboard roster and mark students as present or absent. And then from there, once the teachers mark a student as present or absent, our office managers would go in, and anybody who was absent because of technology reasons, we also gave them present marks, and they were noted with a behavior mark that was the technology P. So that was managed at the admin level. And then on my end, I took that data on the back end and I looked for anything that said either they were present or they were a bit tardy to the class, or they had a technology P mark. If a student had one of those 3 marks, they were given a day mark of present for the whole day. In our district, the requirement is that you log in for 1 minute and then you're just marked as present for the day. And so that was how we rolled that up into a day mark. And so if on the opposite side of the spectrum, if a student was absent, they didn't receive an absent day mark unless they only had absent marks and no present mark, no tardy mark, or no technology P mark existed for them.
Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned, so for us at Voices, if a student didn't show up for their Zoom class, the teachers had to check to see if the student had completed any type of asynchronous work. So our solution was to build a report that pulled usage data from multiple different systems that we used across the network. So instead of having to log into each platform and check to see if a student was active, the teacher could just go to one report and see which students were active that day. So this included pulling usage data from Google Classroom, Achieve 3000, and some other platforms that we used across the network.
Great. Thank you both for presenting this. Yeah, I know this was a challenge that I'm sure many people who are in this session today can relate to. So again, we would love to open it up to questions from the group. Feel free to type any questions that you have about these asynchronous attendance solutions into the chat, or feel free to jump off mute or on video if you would prefer to ask live. Okay. I know one question that I know this is something I've heard come up from a few different people I've talked to working in school data teams is how would you deal with either different schools having different attendance codes or potentially with these different definitions of being present? What are some solutions for that, or how would you work to get everyone on the same page?
Yeah, for Lead Public Schools, we did a lot of work at the beginning of the school year of reframing everyone's mindset. So attendance was previously by minutes, where every minute counted that a student was present in the school. And then it's a drastic change to being, okay, you logged in once, then you're present for the whole day. That's a huge change. And so it was changing people's mindset just a little bit because the environment was different. And then beyond that, it was also a matter of just saying like, hey, this is a very special year. We need to keep things simple. So mark students present or absent. If you want to do other marks, you can. We're just encouraging you to do the very bare minimum. And so we allowed schools to add on to, but not take away from the basics.
Mm-hmm. Similarly, we just needed to make sure that everyone was on the same page. We had the criteria from the state, which wasn't really flexible. You know, we had to do what we had to do. So just making sure that it was very clear what needed to be done on a daily basis, what needed to be done on a weekly basis, and whose job was to do what. So what were the teachers responsible for, what was school staff responsible for, and just making sure everyone was on the same page. We made one-pagers, videos, had trainings, just to make sure that everyone is very clear about what they needed to do this year, because like Azaria said, very different from what we've done in the past. Teachers are now taking attendance on spreadsheets rather than in the student information system, and it just looked very different this year.
Great, thank you both. All right, so also related to the attendance realm, I know another issue that has been on a lot of schools and school systems' minds this year is chronic absenteeism. You know, seeing increases in that, especially with the switch to remote learning, but also certainly, you know, an issue that school systems have to be aware of even before the switch to remote education. So turn it back over to Azaria and Haley to talk about some of the solutions they've developed dealing with chronic absenteeism.
Yes, so Lead Public Schools has several different approaches to chronic absenteeism. The first one I will mention is that every 2 weeks, our data updates in a like a Google spreadsheet, the one in the screenshot at the top, where it lists the students. It gives you an action item in the far left column, and then that action item is saying like, hey, this is how chronic the student is, and this is the letter that needs to go home. And then when a student is chronic, depending on a different, whatever the severity of their chronic absenteeism is, you also have an action item that's highlighted in that particular column, which is why you see like a yellow and orange highlight. And once that action is taken, the highlights go away. So there's a tracking system that the schools, the admin, they use in order to make sure that we're communicating effectively with parents, and we have a record of that. And then on the more, hey, let's just analyze our data front, we have our data reports that are on our data hub. And we have a couple of different reports that do that, but we have just like general, this is your percent of students that are chronic, this is your percent in attendance or your ADA, or this is like your chronic severity report, or here's your week by week attendance. So it kind of depends on what our school staff are looking for and who is looking for it. Is it a network person? Is it a teacher? But we have those data resources that are available on both ends, the logging, the data side, and then the after we've logged it, how are we doing and progressing toward our goal side?
And yeah, chronic absenteeism is something we've always kept a pulse on at our schools, but in the past, it involved our deans manually pulling data from our student information system. So this year, we built out a report that would update on a daily basis, and it would pull a list of our chronically absent students, students that were in danger of being chronically absent, as well as students with perfect attendance. And so a big benefit of this is that we learned that when the deans were manually pulling data, of course, there's room for human error, and there wasn't always a match between our report and what the deans were seeing. And then also it just takes longer, right? They have to go into the system, they have to download the reports, figure out which students are chronically absent. So this report is updated each day. They will always have access to the most current data. And then we're also able to pull in and link our chronic absenteeism data with our academic data, which has been super helpful to pull together into one report to see the effect that being absent has on academics, which we were able to then use as a talking point with our families. And then on other pages of this report, you could see different network and school trends, which led to some pretty interesting finds in the trends that we were seeing this year. So one of the things that we discovered this year was that we actually had the most absences on Wednesdays, which interestingly enough was the day of our asynchronous days for remote learning. And so being able to identify this trend helped us have targeted conversations with families, and it also helped us implement additional support such as having office hours on Wednesdays and other things to support students with showing up on Wednesdays.
And one of the things that we noticed at LEAD was that we had several false starts during our school year. And what I mean by that is our district at various times said, hey, we're going to go back to in-person on such and such a date. And in anticipation of such and such a date, our communication as a school increased to students and their families, and then students and their families were more engaging. They were making sure that their kids were on their Zoom classrooms, etc. So attendance really went up right before we were anticipating starting back to school. And then when those false starts became false, then our attendance kind of dropped off again. And so it was interesting to see that throughout the year, when we look at our weekly attendance that we have that were really high before we're thinking that we're going back, and then we drop off again when it's like, oh, okay, we're going back to the this interesting virtual environment. And so that was very interesting for us.
And one lesson we learned this year was to make sure that chronic absenteeism is on our radar from day one, which it always has been, but next year with this report as a tool, it's going to be super helpful. our deans were able to make so much progress once they had access to the report, because then they're spending less time actually pulling the data and then more time taking actions on the data. So we're looking forward to the bigger impact that our deans will be able to have next year with having access to this report from week one, keeping an eye on the kids before they even become chronically absent, when they're just on our radar at that point.
I think one of the things we're looking forward to next year is having more meaningful attendance data. And by that, I mean, our attendance bar was very low this year. Just log in one time, and that could be for homeroom and not even math class, and the kid is marked as present for the day. And so having metrics this year that we're saying, oh, we have this much percent attendance, it didn't have as much meaning as it has had in past years. And so we're looking forward to just being able to have a little bit more context and more control over the quality of what it means to be present. And then, but if we were to give ourselves a recommendation or advice, if we were to go back and do this virtual year all over again, which I hope none of us have to do next year, by the way, it would be to take virtual attendance a bit more seriously. As I mentioned, in Nashville, we had a lot of false starts. And so our initial fall start was, hey, we'll be back to school on Labor Day or by Labor Day. And so there was just the thought of like, okay, this weird virtual attendance thing isn't really going to matter. It's only going to matter for like a month. And then we can hop back into our normal routine. And so if I were to talk to our past selves or anyone who's doing this again for the next school year, it would just be, hey, just take it seriously from day one, monitor it diligently from day one as if it matters, because it really does matter. And I think we all saw that and show up in different ways this year.
Thank you both so much for sharing. Yeah, it's so interesting to hear some of those insights about different attendance patterns that came up, and also starting to think about how you'll be using these reports moving into the future as well. And again, we'd love to open it up for questions or discussion around the topic of chronic absenteeism. If you do have a question, please feel free to either jump on video or audio, or you can type your question into the chat. Or thinking of some other follow-up is, I know you both touched on this a little bit about, thinking about how you would use these reports moving into the future. Are there any other applications or different ways that you would see yourselves using these, or other reports that you're planning to build out in this area?
I know for Voices, the chronic absenteeism report, our deans are like, we're still going to have this next year, right? Like, this is super helpful. So once things do go, like as I was saying, hopefully things will go back to more normal attendance patterns where it is our typical attendance. But we're still going to keep that report available, just because it is super helpful to always have a pulse on where our students are at. I think for our asynchronous attendance tracking, that's something we probably won't use as much next year, just because we won't be using it to take attendance. But something that might be helpful to build out is, instead of just looking at usage, looking at the usage of those platforms as well as the performance of it, and seeing if students are using these platforms more often, are they actually getting better gains academically as well?
Yeah, and for LEAD, our asynchronous attendance method of taking attendance in our behavior platform, that will not continue, as we will be going back in person. But the rest of our reports, they pull our data from our student information system, so that will continue as usual. And I think one of the benefits of this year was that everybody was super aware and vigilant about attendance, and like, oh, what if can we look at attendance this way or that way? So we have a plethora of attendance reports this year, an abundance of them that can be used in the future and normal years. So the continued use of those is anticipated.
Thank you. And we can also at this point just kind of open it up to a more general Q&A. So for any of the three topics that we went over, which were data hubs, asynchronous attendance and chronic absenteeism, or just data interoperability and integration in general. At this point, please feel free to chat in any thoughts or questions you have about any of those topics. I know one thing that I'd love to hear a little more about is just sort of, in the bigger picture, what were some of the biggest challenges that you both encountered when trying to come up with the solutions that you did this past year?
I think for us, it was just the timeline of everything. Like we got the attendance policies. It's like, okay, here's the policy. First, figure out a system for teachers, then figure out what reports we need. So everything was pretty much like on an expedited basis this year, which was, I think, was a little challenging. And I think also just keeping in mind, like, what exactly do our teachers need this year for taking attendance, and what exactly do our school leaders need? Since things do look this year, just trying to identify what the key reports were that would be the most helpful during this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that for us, it was the same as like there's a quick turnaround. Sometimes you get an update of, oh, this is what we're doing now, and can you make it happen in like 5 minutes? And so rushing to get everything ready, but also being aware, hey, we also need to slow down enough to make sure that we do it right and make the system last, because we don't want to recreate this again next week and the week after and the week after. So trying to slow down a little bit to make sure that we ask the right questions, to make sure that we're building things well. And then I'd say the other piece was just to simplify as much as possible. And I think that really went a long way, because there's just so much uncertainty this year, and adding an additional click could just kind of be the straw that broke the camel's back for somebody. So for me, that was like making sure that we were building processes that made it as simple as possible for teachers and for admin, that they weren't going here, there, and everywhere to get the information that they needed to take action. It was just simple. Even if it made it more complex for me, it's like, I can handle it. I don't want you to have to.
Yeah, I love that, in both of the solutions that you both developed, you had that piece of building the instructions right in, whether it was written instructions or, through a video tutorial. I think that available at users' fingertips is such a powerful thing to be able to implement, and really, especially at a time when, with so much going on, just having that be so easy to access is huge, and certainly shows a lot of thought for your users and what they're experiencing from your end. And I guess also related to, some of what you were sharing about some of the challenges, I know when you're developing these reports, there's a lot of different user needs you have to think about, and you're balancing, what the district needs with what your state needs, what your school staff and school and network leadership is recommending. How did you both tackle that of having to prioritize different data report decisions based on what some of those different stakeholders were asking for, what some of their differing needs were?
I think for me, I think it sometimes depends. Sometimes depending on the urgency, if it's something super important that needs to get done, right, that happens first. I think next, I then think about which has the largest audience. If it's a report that's going to help one teacher versus a report that's going to help our whole network of teachers, I'm going to prioritize the one that helps the network first, and just thinking about the impact that the report could have. And then also sometimes I think if it's something quick, I'll just do the quick report first, get it out of the way, and then focus on the one that might take a little bit more time.
Yeah, I agree. Prioritizing what's the biggest audience here, that's going to have the biggest benefit across the network. And then I think the other thing that I do is in all of my reports, I add a lot of filters. Everybody wants to see the same data, but cut a different way. Mm-hmm. And so in order for me to save my sanity, I just add all of the filters, whether they be demographic or gender or like grade wise or whatever, just all the filters I can possibly add to the report, so that everyone feels like their needs are met. Like, oh, this report was made just for me, when really it has the larger audience in mind, but they can get exactly what they want out of it.
Yeah, definitely. And again, we have a couple more minutes for questions before we start to wrap up. So any other questions that anyone in the session has for Azaria and Haley and about the great work that they've done, please feel free to type them into the chat. I know another question that I just thought of as you were talking about, adding these filters and thinking about how people are going to be using reports is when you're coming up with these reports or attendance reports, especially, I know you talked about some of the different trends you were able to identify about, what days of the week there were the biggest attendance challenges and things like that. How did you really find when you were in the building and creation process? What was your thought process in thinking about how to most meaningfully analyze your data? And what was your process for coming up with those questions and thinking about how you would tackle them?
I think for me, whenever I'm building out a report, I always go to whoever the audience is and ask them questions like, what information do you want to get out of this report? What questions do you want to be able to be answered by this report? And kind of start from there. So if they're wondering, oh, hey, I'm wondering what day of the week there's more kids absent, then we build that into the report. Or I want more information on, just like whatever trends they want to have or whatever questions they have. I always usually before I even start building the report, I meet with whoever's going to be looking at the report and just kind of get their insight and hear what questions they want to be answered.
Yeah, similarly, a lot of the reports come from a data request. And so in that data request, some of the basic questions of like, hey, what information are you looking for? What kind of filters do you want? And then I'll get an email with that information, and then I'll follow up and say like, hey, there are about 10 different ways to calculate this. What did you actually have in mind when you asked for fill in the blank? And so that kind of helps narrow down the process. So I'm making sure that, for example, like if somebody's asking, hey, what is our school's attrition rate? I know exactly what they mean by attrition, and I'm not giving them like a mobility rate or like an October to October attrition rate versus like an in-year. So there are just so many different ways to calculate things, and I just want to make sure that we're aligned with definition before I build the report. And then I think the other thing, depending on what the report is, if there are just a ton of questions that need to be answered by it, then I just break up the report by questions. So there will literally be a question and then a table that you can get the answers from. Can you get other answers from that table? For sure. But it helps them and other users of that report know like, oh, okay, this is kind of the question that I was asking or similar to the question that was in my mind. So they kind of can navigate through the different reports based on the questions that are kind of baked into the report itself.
I think the first thing you mentioned there was super important of making sure it's clear what people are asking and the answer you're giving them. I think a lot of the times people have a question, but they're not sure specifically what they're asking. So it's always super important to follow up being like, this is what I'm calculating. This is how I'm calculating it. This is what I'm giving you. And this is what it all means. Or like, this is how you can interpret it. It's just super helpful because I know it's happened before. I share a report, share data with someone and they take it and go a different way with it. And I'm like, no, that's not exactly what it means. So it's definitely super important to ask those follow-up questions. And have those conversations.
Yeah, especially if those reports, for example, are going to like your annual reporting or for funding, just make sure you're telling the right story.
I always like overwrite an explanation of like, this is exactly what it's saying and this is how you can use it. And then even sometimes this is how you can't use it, just if I ever think there's going to be some type of misinterpretation there.
100%.
I love that. Yeah, always better to over-explain.
Which again is why like I think same with you with your video instruction videos, that's what we include on our first page of the report of like this is exactly what it means, this is exactly what's included, and then sometimes this is not how it should be used or like this is what you shouldn't use it for.
Yeah, and one of the things that I get a little bit particular about is with attendance. And for us in Tennessee, there's a difference between ADA calculations and percent and attendance calculations, but a lot of our lingo gets swapped and people call percent and attendance ADA. And so I distinctly meet with people and say, this is the definition of the one number and this is the definition of the other. You will, if you see percent in attendance or PIA, this is the number you're looking for. You're not looking for ADA. So just being very clear with my audience of like, hey, you're used to calling it this way, but hey, let's redefine things and use the right definition sometimes. So sometimes that's necessary as well.
Definitely. Well, thank you both so much. I know we have just under a minute left. So just wanted to thank you both, Azaria and Haley, so much for sharing your expertise. If anyone here today has any questions about interoperability, or if you're looking for more information, we have links to Project Unicorn as well as Voices and Lead Schools in the notes below. We'll also add the whole PowerPoint presentation to this page in case you joined a little later and you'd like to download that. If you're interested in data interoperability in schools, you can sign the Project Unicorn Pledge and get updates from our program. So we'd love to have you do that if that's something you're interested in. And again, thank you all so much for attending today. This was great. And Azaria and Haley, so lucky to have you here as speakers. Thank you so much for providing your expertise. And yeah, we hope to be in touch with you and see you all at future sessions and maybe see you at a future event or webinar.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks for having us, Elise, and thanks everyone for attending.
All right, thanks everybody. Bye.